winter of 1886 carved its name into the Dakota plains like a curse. For 3 straight days, wind screamed across the high country, stripping bark from trees and tearing shingles from the few houses stubborn enough to stand against it. When the storm finally broke, the land looked less like America and more like a white desert, silent, endless, and merciless. At dawn, Elias Kane rode through what was left of the old rail stop near Bismarck. The depot roof had caved in, telegraph wires hung like dead snakes, and the snowdrifts were high enough to swallow a horse whole. He hadn't planned on finding anyone alive. But halfway through the ruins, he spotted movement. Something half buried beside a toppled bench. He dismounted, boots crunching on ice, and swept the snow away. It wasn't a something. It was a someone. A woman lay there, wrapped in a threadbare gray coat, her face white as the snow around her. One hand still clutched a carpet bag stiff with frost. For a heartbeat, he thought she was gone, until a faint breath clouded the air. "Hold on, lady," he muttered, slipping off his buffalo hide coat. "You're not dying here." He lifted her easily, feeling how light she was, more like a bundle of sticks than a person, and carried her to his horse. By the time he reached his ranch house an hour later, his beard was crusted with ice and the wind had begun howling again, as if angry that its prey had been stolen. Inside, the fire roared to life. Elias laid her near the hearth and unwrapped the frozen coat. Beneath it was a simple dress of city make, travel-stained but once fine. Her hair, a tangled auburn mess, caught the firelight like copper. He rubbed her hands, forcing warmth back into the pale fingers. When her eyelids fluttered open, they revealed eyes the color of storm clouds, confused, frightened, and fiercely alive. "Now where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, cracked by cold. "My ranch, 20 miles west of Bismarck," Elias said. "Name's Kane." She swallowed hard. Clara Bennett. I was heading west." "Alone?" She nodded weakly. "Had to leave. A man back east made it impossible to stay." Elias didn't press. He'd seen enough broken folks drift across the plains, all running from something, debts, mistakes, or ghosts. Still, something in her tone made the hairs on his neck stand. Through the night, Clara slept fitfully, muttering names he didn't know. Once she woke screaming, convinced someone was breaking down the door. He held her shoulders until the trembling stopped. By dawn, color had returned to her cheeks, but the fear in her eyes lingered. When she finally spoke again, her words chilled him more than the storm outside. "He'll come looking for me," she whispered. "And when he does, he'll bring death with him." Elias studied her across the flickering firelight. The runaway nurse with a haunted past, the snow still melting from her hair, and felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't known in years. The urge to protect. Outside, the wind rose again, shaking the shutters like warning drums. Somewhere out there, beyond the endless white, a man might indeed be searching for her. And in that moment, Elias Kane understood. The blizzard hadn't merely blown a stranger to his door. It had delivered trouble, heartbreak, and perhaps destiny itself. When morning came, the storm had quieted to a mournful wind. The prairie looked reborn in white silence. Every fence post a small grave marker poking through the snow. Inside the ranch house, Clara sat wrapped in a wool blanket near the hearth, her face pale but alive. Elias had fried bacon and eggs on the stove, the smell filling the cabin. "You need food," he said, sliding a plate toward her. "You were near gone when I found you." She tried to smile, but her hands trembled as she lifted the fork. The first bite turned to ash in her mouth. I'm grateful," she whispered. "You saved my life." Any decent man would have done the same, Elias replied. But he knew that wasn't true. Out here, decency was often buried with the snow. After breakfast, he saddled a horse and rode to the neighboring homestead for supplies. When he returned, Clara was standing by the window, staring at the horizon as though expecting something, or someone. "Looking for the sun?" he asked lightly. "No," she said, voice low. "For smoke. He's good with fire." That night she told him the truth. Clara Bennett had once been the head nurse at a small hospital in St. Louis. She'd been proud of her work, known for steady hands and stubborn compassion. But the hospital's chief surgeon, Dr. Milton Gage, had other intentions. When she rejected his advances, he spread rumors, claimed she'd stolen morphine, endangered patients, even hinted she'd been mad. Within a week, her career was gone. Elias listened silently, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. "I thought I could escape it," she said, eyes glistening in the firelight. "But he followed me, wrote to every place I sought work, calling me a thief, a liar, worse. I left Missouri under another name, took a train west." She hesitated, fingers clutching the blanket. "Before I boarded, my boarding house caught fire. The papers said it was an accident. But the sheriff whispered that a man had been seen near the stables. Someone who looked like Gage." Elias stared into the flames, the wood popping like distant gunfire. "You think he's still after you?" "I know he is," she said. "He told me once that if I ran, he'd find me, even if it meant chasing me to the edge of the world." The wind howled outside as though echoing her words. Over the next days, Clara regained her strength. She insisted on helping with chores, mending shirts, and tending the horses. But she jumped at every sound, every distant crack of a branch. Elias began sleeping lighter, his rifle always near the door. Then one night, he found something that froze his blood, a scrap of charred paper lodged in the fence outside the barn. Its edges blackened, but the ink still legible enough to read her name, Clara Bennett. He turned it over and saw the faint outline of a red wax seal, the kind used by city doctors. "Someone's been close," he said quietly, showing it to her. Clara's face drained of color. "It's his," she whispered. "I'd recognize that seal anywhere. He's here." That night, neither of them slept. Elias kept the fire low and the lamps dark. From the window, he watched the moonlit fields for any sign of movement. Once, just before dawn, he thought he saw a figure standing near the tree line, too far to make out, but tall, still and watching. The next morning, the snow around the ranch was trampled by strange footprints. They circled the barn, crossed by the corral, and ended beneath Clara's window. Elias crouched beside them, running his gloved fingers through the prints. The edges were sharp, fresh. When he returned inside, Clara was sitting by the fire, clutching her carpet bag. Her eyes were wild with fear. "I can't stay," she said. "He'll burn this place like he did before." "You don't understand, Mr. Kane. He doesn't just ruin people. He destroys them." Elias took a long breath, his hand resting on the rifle. "Then let him come," he said. "If he wants a fight, he'll find one." But even as he spoke the words, Clara knew that men like Dr. Gage didn't fight fair. They poisoned, framed, and set fire in the night. And somewhere beyond the white horizon, smoke was already beginning to rise. The storm broke, but the chill between them lingered like an unspoken truth. Days passed beneath a sun that glittered coldly over the plains. Clara moved about the ranch as though trying to repay her debt, mending harnesses, cooking simple meals, sweeping floors that didn't need sweeping. Elias protested once or twice, but she only smiled faintly and kept working. He had never met a woman like her. She didn't complain, didn't pry. When she laughed, rarely, It was a quiet, musical sound that made him forget the wind's mournful cry outside. But there was something hidden behind her eyes, something heavy as the Dakota winter itself. At night, Elias would sit by the fire, pretending to read the same paragraph over and over while Clara repaired torn gloves or polished his coffee pot. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was charged, alive, like lightning too shy to strike. One evening, as snow fell softly against the windows, she set her mending aside and asked, "Do you believe in destiny, Mr. Kane?" He looked up from his book. "Can't say I've thought much about it." "I have," she said, eyes distant. "Every choice I made led me farther from safety. Yet somehow it led me here, to this cabin, to you. Perhaps destiny isn't about where we go, but who we meet along the way." Elias stared into the fire. "Or maybe it's just the storm doing God's work in strange ways." She smiled at that, but there was sadness in it. "Then perhaps God has a cruel sense of humor." When she rose to tend the fire, her shawl slipped from her shoulders. Elias saw the faint outline of a scar just below her collarbone, small, round, old. A bullet wound by the look of it. She noticed his eyes, quickly pulling the fabric closed. "Miss Bennett," he began gently, "that mark, a gift from Dr. Gage," she said before he could finish. Her tone was calm, but her hands trembled as she added another log to the flames. "He said if he couldn't have me, no one would." I thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. Elias felt a cold anger rise within him, but Clara turned away before he could speak. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said. "The wound healed. The memory didn't." He stood slowly, crossing the room. "He'll never touch you again. Not while I'm breathing." Clara turned to face him then, her gray eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "You shouldn't make promises like that, Elias Kane. You don't know what kind of man he is." "I don't need to," he said softly. "I know what kind of man I am." The firelight threw shadows across their faces as they stood there, inches apart. For a long, breathless moment, neither moved. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Inside, something far more dangerous stirred. A fragile warmth that neither of them dared to name. Finally, Clara broke the spell. "I should rest," she whispered, stepping back. "Tomorrow will be clearer. The snow will melt." "Maybe," he said, watching her retreat toward the small bedroom. "But some things shouldn't melt." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat by the dying embers, staring at the closed door that separated them. He told himself it was pity he felt. Simple compassion for a broken soul. But pity didn't make a man's pulse quicken or his thoughts wander toward the sound of soft breathing in the next room. Near dawn, the door creaked open. Clara stood there in the dim firelight, wrapped in a blanket. "The wind's too loud," she murmured. "I can't sleep." Elias rose and wordlessly added wood to the fire. "Sit," he said, motioning toward the chair by the hearth. She did, curling her feet beneath the blanket, eyes following the dance of flames. For a while, they said nothing. Then Clara whispered, "I used to believe I'd never feel safe again." "Do you now?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "For the first time in years." "I do." Elias looked at her across the fire, her face glowing softly in the light, and realized that safety wasn't the only thing she was giving him. She was giving him purpose again, and the dangerous hope that a man who'd stopped believing in love might find it where the world least expected. Delivered by a blizzard, wrapped in sorrow, and sitting quietly by his fire. The thaw came slowly that March, as if the earth itself feared to wake from its frozen sleep. Snowmelt carved silver veins through the prairie, and the wind softened from a roar to a restless sigh. Life returned to the Kane ranch, one cautious day at a time. Clara had taken charge of the household with quiet precision. By the second week, she'd reorganized Elias's storeroom, repaired the roof leaks herself, and even found a way to keep the chicken coop from freezing at night by diverting heat from the smokehouse. "It's nothing," she said when Elias marveled. "Just a matter of watching how the wind moves." But it wasn't nothing. It was genius born of necessity. She saw patterns others ignored. The way snow drifted against the barn meant where the boards were weak. The faint cough of a horse hinted at moldy feed. The rhythm of the wind told her when another storm was coming. One afternoon, when Elias and his ranch hands were mending a broken fence near the creek, Clara appeared on horseback, her skirts tucked up like a man's, riding with easy grace. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Elias called. "I came because you're about to lose the herd," she said calmly, pointing toward the horizon. A strange haze shimmered there, low and fast-moving. "A dust storm," Elias muttered. "Hours off yet." "Minutes," she corrected. "Look how the birds are flying inland. Feel the air, too dry, too sudden. Get the cattle to higher ground now, or they'll stampede into the riverbed." Elias didn't question her twice. He shouted orders, and within 10 minutes, the men had driven the herd up the slope. When the dust storm hit, it came like a monster's breath, blinding, choking, relentless. They sheltered behind the ridge as the land disappeared in a whirl of brown fury. When it passed, the herd was safe, and so were they. Elias turned to her, face streaked with dirt. "You just saved 100 head of cattle." She brushed dust from her coat. "No, I just listened. The plains always tell you what's coming. Most men don't care to hear." That night, over a simple supper, he asked, "Where'd you learn to think like that?" "My father," she said, smiling faintly. "He was a mapmaker. Always said the earth keeps secrets in plain sight, if you're humble enough to read them." Elias studied her with quiet admiration. "And here I thought you were a nurse." "I was," she replied. "Still am. But a woman has to be more than one thing to survive in this world." The way she said it lingered with him long after she'd gone to her room. Over the next weeks, she proved it again and again. When a fever swept through the nearby settlement, Clara rode out with a saddlebag of herbs and instruments, staying 3 days until every child could breathe without gasping. When a sick horse lay dying, she mixed a tonic from boiled willow bark and honey, coaxing it back to life. Word spread quietly through the territory about the woman at Kane Ranch, the one who healed people, fixed machines, and saw things men overlooked. One evening, as the sun sank into gold behind the cottonwoods, Elias found her at the corral, sketching something in the dirt. "What's that?" he asked. "An irrigation plan," she said without looking up. "You lose too much water to evaporation in summer. If we dig shallow trenches along the northern edge and build small dams here and here," she marked with a stick, "we can redirect runoff from the spring thaw. It'll keep the grass longer and double your hay yield." Elias knelt beside her, tracing the lines with his finger. "You're drawing a new kind of ranch." She smiled, eyes meeting his. "No, just a smarter one." They both laughed, but the laughter softened into silence. The last light caught in her hair, turning it to copper. He wanted to tell her what she'd become to him, how her mind fascinated him more than her beauty. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he said quietly, "You don't just survive the West, Clara. You outthink it." She looked at him then, her expression unreadable. "Maybe that's why I'm still alive." For a long moment, neither moved. Then she stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "Come inside," she said. "There's stew on the stove. You'll catch cold standing out here worshiping the horizon." As they walked toward the cabin, side by side, Elias felt a shift, subtle but real. The woman he had rescued was no longer a burden nor a mystery. She was becoming his equal, his compass, and perhaps, if fate allowed, something far more dangerous, his reason to hope again. The prairie was a restless ocean that evening, glowing red under a bruised sky. Elias and Clara had spent the day hauling timber, patching fences, and arguing quietly about her insistence on working alongside the men. She'd cut her hand on a nail and refused help. He'd scolded her for being stubborn. She'd accused him of treating her like glass. The air between them was as sharp as broken ice. By dusk, the storm clouds gathered again. Thin, dark veils crawling over the horizon. Elias stacked the last of the wood by the porch and saw her standing at the fence, her shawl whipping in the wind, staring into the distance. "You're thinking too loud again," he said softly, walking toward her. Clara didn't turn. "The air feels wrong. It's too still for rain." "You and that instinct of yours," he said, trying to smile. "You always know when trouble's coming." "I wish I didn't," she whispered. "It makes me live half in fear." He stepped closer, close enough to see the faint freckles on her cheek, the scar just beneath her collarbone that she still tried to hide. "You don't have to live in fear anymore." She looked up then, eyes glimmering in the half-light. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Elias." The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the faintest smell of smoke. Elias turned sharply toward the east. Beyond the hills, an orange glow trembled against the night. "Fire," Clara said. They saddled the horses in silence, riding hard toward the neighboring ridge. The fire wasn't far. One of the rancher's supply sheds had gone up in flames. Elias cursed under his breath. The fire hadn't started on its own. He could tell by the way it spread. Someone had soaked the timbers in oil first. "Stay back," he warned, jumping from his horse. But Clara was already dismounting, running toward the burning shed with a blanket and a bucket. "Clara!" She didn't listen. She plunged into the smoke, beating at the flames near a hay cart that could have exploded any second. Elias grabbed another blanket, sprinted in after her, and together they smothered the blaze before it could reach the corral. When it was finally over, both were coughing, faces blackened with soot. Elias caught her by the shoulders, shaking with fury and fear. "You could have been killed. So could you," she shot back, eyes flashing. "And yet here we both are." He opened his mouth to retort, but stopped when he saw her trembling hands. She wasn't reckless. She was terrified. "It was him, wasn't it?" he said quietly. "Gage." She nodded, tears mixing with ash. "He's close. He's reminding me that I'll never be free." Elias's voice dropped to a rough whisper. "He'll have to go through me first." She shook her head. "He'll destroy you too. He always finds a way." He took her face in his soot-stained hands. "Then let him find me. Let him see what kind of man stands beside you." The moment stretched between them, breathless and raw. The fire crackled low behind them, and the night pulsed with wind and heartbeat. Clara looked up, her lips parting as if to speak. But no words came. He leaned closer, and for the first time since that frozen morning he'd found her, the world fell utterly still. His lips brushed hers softly at first, tentative, reverent, as though asking permission from a past that had already stolen too much from her. Then she pressed back, her hands gripping his coat, the kiss deepening with all the ache of two people who had been running from themselves and had finally found somewhere to stop. When they broke apart, the air between them was alive with what they didn't dare say. "I'm sorry," Elias murmured, breathless. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't," she interrupted, eyes shining. "Don't you dare apologize for making me feel alive again." A rumble of distant thunder rolled across the plains. Elias brushed a strand of hair from her face, his hand trembling. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it together. No running, no hiding." Clara looked up at him, tears cutting pale lines through the soot. "Together?" she echoed. The fire was dying now, its smoke curling toward the stars. The wind quieted, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Witness to a promise sealed not in words, but in the touch of two souls who had finally stopped fleeing the storm and learned to face it side by side. The morning after the fire, the prairie seemed too quiet. Not peaceful, just holding its breath. Smoke still curled from the blackened remains of the supply shed, twisting into the pale sky like a warning too late to heed. Elias hadn't slept. He stood on the porch with his rifle across his arm, watching the horizon. Every creak of the windmill, every cry of a hawk made his pulse quicken. Inside, Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. The skin at her wrists was red from the heat of the flames. But it wasn't the burns that haunted her. It was the scent of kerosene, the methodical way the fire had been set. He was toying with her, sending messages in smoke. When Elias finally came in, his eyes were hard. "I rode out at dawn," he said. "Found tracks heading east. One man on a bay horse. He camped about 3 miles off. Close enough to watch, far enough to vanish." Clara's breath caught. "Then it's him. I'd bet my life on it." She rose, her voice trembling with both fear and fury. "You can't go after him. That's what he wants. He wants to draw you out." Elias leaned his rifle against the wall. "And you want me to wait until he burns us in our sleep?" "Please," she said, stepping closer. "I couldn't bear to lose you." The words escaped before she could stop them. They hung in the air, like a confession. Elias looked at her for a long moment, the tension between them thick as thunderclouds. "You won't," he said finally, voice low. "Not while I'm breathing." That night, they barricaded the doors and set a lantern in every window. Elias sat by the fire with a rifle across his knees, while Clara moved silently through the room, her nerves taut. The wind began to rise again, rattling the shutters like bony fingers. Sometime near midnight, the horses screamed. Elias was on his feet in an instant, bolting for the door. Clara grabbed her pistol and followed. Outside, the corral gate hung open. Hoof prints tore across the frozen ground toward the creek. One of the horses, a chestnut mare, lay struggling, her flanks slashed open. And there, nailed to the post beside the gate, was a folded piece of paper, pinned by a knife. Elias yanked it free. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, unmistakable. "You took what belonged to me. Now I'll take her back." Clara went pale. "He's close, too close." Elias turned to her, every muscle rigid. "We ride now." They saddled the remaining horses and rode into the dark, following the fresh tracks along the creek bed. The moon hung low, silver and watchful. The night was alive with sound, the rush of water, the crack of branches, the pulse of hooves in snow. After nearly an hour, they reached the canyon edge. The tracks disappeared into a narrow ravine below. Elias dismounted and handed Clara his revolver. "Stay here. I'm not waiting while you risk your life," she shot back. "He's after me, Elias. I end this, not you." Before he could argue, a voice echoed from the ravine. Smooth, confident, venomous. "Clara, how touching. Your savior finally found his courage." Dr. Milton Gage stepped out from the shadows, revolver glinting in his hand, a cruel smile twisting his face. Elias raised his rifle. "You take one step closer, and I'll put you down." Gage laughed softly. "Do it, and every lawman from here to St. Louis will call you a murderer." She told them I was dead, you know. Imagine their surprise when I ride back with her to prove otherwise. Clara's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You'll never touch me again, Milton." "Touch you?" he sneered. "No, my dear. I intend to ruin you, just as you ruined me." Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. That's enough. But before he could fire, Gage swung his gun toward Clara. The shot rang out, a flash of light and thunder in the narrow canyon. Clara gasped, stumbling backward, and Elias fired instinctively, his bullet striking Gage square in the chest. The doctor collapsed into the snow, his blood spreading like ink. The echo faded, leaving only the roar of the wind and Clara's ragged breathing. Elias rushed to her side. "You're hit?" She shook her head, dazed. "No, it grazed my arm." Relief broke through his anger, fierce and trembling. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he could anchor her to the living world by sheer will. "It's over," he whispered. But even as she clung to him, tears freezing on her cheeks, Clara looked past his shoulder into the darkness. "No, Elias. It's never over for women like me. There's always another man who thinks he owns us." He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Then he'll have to go through me, and through every sunrise between us." Clara pressed her forehead to his, their breaths mingling in the cold. Around them, the wind quieted, as though exhausted by what it had witnessed. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a cry half grief, half freedom. And as the first light of dawn touched the snow, Elias realized that the woman fate had blown to his door was more than a survivor. She was a storm of her own, fierce and unbroken, and he was done running from the wind. The world was washed clean by morning light. The snow that had witnessed blood and fire now glittered like crushed glass under the new sun. Elias and Clara rode back to the ranch in silence, the air between them thick with what hadn't yet been said. The danger was gone, Gage's shadow buried in the canyon. But the storm inside them had only just begun. At the gate, Elias helped her down from the saddle. She winced as her arm brushed the reins, the bandage beneath her sleeve already dark with blood. He caught her hand, holding it a moment too long. "You need that wound cleaned." "I've treated worse," she said softly, though her voice trembled. "Not from me, you haven't." He guided her inside, the cabin still carrying the faint scent of smoke and pine. The fire crackled to life again, casting light over her face. Clara sat at the table, and Elias carefully unwrapped the bandage. The bullet had grazed deep, angry and red, but not fatal. His rough hands, used to mending fences and breaking horses, moved with surprising tenderness as he washed the wound. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Only when you stop touching me," she whispered. He froze, the water dripping from his fingers. Her words hung there, fragile as the morning sunlight through the window. She looked up at him then. No fear, no hesitation. Just the quiet truth of someone who had spent too long pretending not to feel. "Clara," he began, but his voice broke. She placed her uninjured hand on his cheek. "You saved me more than once, Elias Kane. But you can't keep saving me from what I already want." He caught her hand, turning it over, pressing his lips to her palm. The kiss was slow, reverent, a vow without words. Then he rose and drew her gently to her feet. For a long moment, they simply stood there, faces inches apart, the fire painting gold across their skin. Her breath came shallow. His chest rose and fell like a man fighting to stay composed and losing the battle gladly. "You don't have to be afraid of wanting me," she said. "I stopped being afraid the night you walked into the fire." He answered her the only way a man who'd run out of words could. He kissed her. It wasn't the hesitant touch they'd shared before. This kiss was deep, raw, and unguarded. Years of loneliness and fear burning away in a single heartbeat. She tasted salt and smoke, warmth and relief. His hands framed her face, sliding to her shoulders, drawing her closer until every breath was shared. When they finally broke apart, the world outside seemed impossibly still. Elias leaned his forehead against hers, his voice hoarse. "You have no idea what you've done to me." "I think I do," she murmured. "You've done the same to me." He laughed quietly, but there was pain in it. The kind that only comes when a man realizes how much he has to lose. I swore I'd never let anyone close again. Not after what the war took from me. Then you showed up, half frozen and defiant, and everything I believed started coming apart. She smiled through her tears. And I thought I was done with love after St. Louis. But it seems God and the wind had other plans. Outside, the wind shifted, gentler now, whispering through the cottonwoods like a blessing. Elias touched her cheek. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, Clara Bennett. But I know this. Whatever comes, I want it with you. She placed her hand over his heart. Then you already know what tomorrow looks like. The fire burned low, its light flickering across their faces as he drew her into his arms again. The snow outside melted from the warmth within the cabin, droplets running down the window like tears of the earth itself. Later, as night crept across the plains, Clara lay against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. She traced the faint scars that crossed his skin, remnants of a life spent surviving rather than living. When you found me, she whispered, I thought I was the one being rescued. But I see it now, you were just as lost. Elias tightened his arms around her. Maybe that's what love really is. Two people lost in the storm who stop pretending they know the way home. The fire crackled one last time, and silence settled over the cabin. Outside, the first stars appeared above the vast Dakota sky. Cold, eternal, and quietly watching, as two battered souls finally surrendered to the peace they'd been denied. When spring finally came to the Dakota plains, it didn't arrive gently. It burst forth like music after silence. The fields blushed green again, wildflowers nodded in the wind, and the river that had once frozen solid now sang its way through the valley. The long winter, the danger, the fear, the blood, felt like a memory half remembered from another life. Clara stood on the porch one morning, breathing in the scent of damp earth and pine. The sunlight poured over her face, soft and golden, and for the first time in years, she didn't flinch from it. Behind her, Elias was fixing the latch on the barn door, humming tunelessly. He had taken to humming lately, something she'd never heard him do before. When he caught her watching, he smiled. A rare, easy smile that still startled her every time. What? He asked, wiping his hands on a rag. You hum now, she said. Men only do that when they're happy. Maybe I finally have a reason to be. Clara laughed, a sound the wind seemed to carry out over the fields. Life had returned to the ranch in more ways than one. The horses had foaled early, the herds were strong, and the small garden she'd planted behind the house was already sprouting green. The land itself seemed to mirror their hearts, scarred but healing. Each day they worked side by side, their rhythm wordless and easy. Clara organized the ranch's supplies, wrote careful ledgers in her precise handwriting, and convinced Elias to let her start a small clinic for the nearby settlers. You can't fix the whole territory, he'd said. Watch me try, she'd replied with a grin. And she did. Within weeks, families began arriving from miles away. Injured ranch hands, feverish children, weary mothers seeking advice. Clara treated them all, charging little or nothing. She was tireless, and somehow her kindness made the ranch feel like more than a business. It became a place of refuge. Elias often watched her from a distance, his heart too full for words. He'd built fences and barns his whole life, but Clara built something stronger. Trust, community, belonging. One afternoon, while she was tending to a boy's broken arm, Elias lingered at the doorway, hat in hand. When the child had gone, Clara turned to him, brow glistening, eyes bright. You're staring, she said, half teasing. He stepped closer. Just thinking how every time you heal someone, It feels like you're fixing a piece of me, too. Clara smiled softly. Then you must be nearly whole by now. Not until I ask you something, he said, reaching into his pocket. Her breath caught. He didn't kneel. Elias Kane wasn't the kneeling kind. But his voice was steady and full of quiet reverence. Clara Bennett, you rode into my life on the back of a storm. I thought I was saving you that night. But truth is, you saved me right back. I don't want a day more without you beside me. Will you marry me? For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind, the birds, even the restless river. Then Clara's lips parted in a trembling smile. Yes, she said simply. 1,000 times, yes. He laughed then, unrestrained, boyish, and lifted her off her feet, spinning her once before setting her down. When he kissed her, the whole prairie seemed to lean closer, as if even the earth wanted to witness it. They married beneath the open sky 2 weeks later. The ranch hands built an arch of wildflowers. The neighbors came with pies and fiddles, and the preacher's voice carried clear across the valley. When Elias said, "I do," his voice cracked with emotion. When Clara answered, "So do I," half the women in the crowd wept. That night, the ranch was alive with light and laughter. There was music, dancing, and stories told by firelight until the stars blurred into dawn. Elias and Clara slipped away before sunrise, walking down to the river where the water glowed pink with morning. Clara knelt to touch it, feeling its chill between her fingers. "We've both been through the fire," she said softly. "Now we get to begin again." Elias wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Then let's build something that lasts." She leaned back against him, eyes closing, the wind playing gently with her hair. "We already have," she whispered. The sun rose higher, gilding the prairie in gold. The river ran steady and sure, carrying away the ashes of the past. And on that spring morning, under a sky wide enough to hold their whole story, Elias Kane and Clara Bennett began the life they had fought so hard to find. One not built on fear or rescue, but on love freely chosen and deeply earned. Years passed like pages turning in a well-worn book. The prairie changed its colors 1,000 times, green to gold, gold to white, white back to green again. And life on the Kane ranch moved with the rhythm of the land. Where there had once been smoke and gunfire, there was laughter now, and the sound of children running through tall grass. Clara and Elias had built more than a home. They had built a world. By the second spring of their marriage, the ranch had grown into a thriving community. New cabins dotted the hills, and the clinic Clara had begun in her kitchen had turned into a proper building with clean cots, medicine shelves, and a brass plaque that read, "Bennett Kane Healing House." Settlers came from as far as the Missouri border for her care. She never refused anyone, no matter how poor or desperate. Elias, for his part, turned the ranch into one of the finest in the Dakota territory. But wealth never hardened him. He carried his success the way he carried his hat, easy, unpretentious, and always tipped in gratitude to the people who helped him earn it. He hired families instead of drifters, paid fair wages, and built a schoolhouse beside the chapel, so the children of his workers could read and dream bigger than the horizon. In every way that mattered, the Kane Ranch was no longer a place, it was a heartbeat. Clara and Elias worked hard, argued fiercely, laughed often. They raised 2 children. Samuel, with his father's strong hands and calm eyes, and Rosalie, whose curiosity and wit mirrored her mother's. The children grew up among the scent of horses, ink, and wild sage, learning early that love was not something fragile to be hidden away. It was something you worked for, protected, and lived out loud. When storms swept across the plains, Clara no longer trembled. She stood at the window, Elias beside her, and said, "The wind used to sound like ghosts. Now it sounds like home." Elias would wrap an arm around her and answer, "That's because it's carrying our story." As the years passed, their story spread far beyond the ranch. The townspeople started calling Clara the Angel of the Prairie. Doctors from Bismarck and Fargo came to study her techniques. Her use of herbal medicine, her fearless surgeries in places no other healer dared go. She trained young women to follow in her footsteps, insisting that healing was not a man's calling or a woman's. It was a human duty. Elias often watched her teach, pride shining in his eyes. "You've done more with a few bandages and a brave heart than I've done with 50 acres of cattle," he once told her. She smiled, brushing a streak of dust from his cheek. "You built a world where healing could happen. That's your gift." In 1894, the railroad reached the valley, bringing new settlers, trade, and opportunity. The Kanes helped build the first town hall, the first telegraph line, and later, at Clara's insistence, the first small hospital west of the river. They named it St. Mary's Crossing, after the creek where Elias had once found her near frozen. Their love was the kind that made others believe in miracles. Every Sunday, they walked to the chapel hand in hand. Every night, no matter how tired, they sat together by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes saying nothing at all, just watching the flames dance on the walls they'd built together. When the children grew up, Samuel took over ranch operations, while Rosalie became a nurse, following her mother's path. Clara often joked that the land was Elias's first child, and medicine was hers, and somehow both had found their way into the next generation. One autumn evening, as crimson leaves blew across the porch, Elias sat beside her, older now, his hair silver, his hands rough as bark. "Do you ever think about how it all began?" he asked quietly. Clara smiled, her gaze lost somewhere in the horizon. "Every day. A storm, a stranger, a promise. It shouldn't have lasted. And yet, here we are." He took her hand. "I reckon love that's earned in the storm doesn't wash away in the rain." They sat in silence, the sunset spilling gold across the land that bore their name. Inside the house, laughter echoed. Samuel's wife scolding him for tracking in mud, little Rosalie humming as she studied. Life, imperfect and beautiful, had come full circle. Later that night, Clara wrote a letter by lamplight. It began, "To the one who finds this after we're gone, know that happiness is not something given, but something made." She folded it, tucked it into her old carpet bag, the same one Elias had carried through the snow all those years ago, and set it on the mantel beside the family Bible. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the cottonwoods. But this time it didn't sound like warning. It sounded like gratitude. As she climbed into bed beside Elias, he stirred, half asleep, and murmured, "Still here?" "Always," she whispered. And when the lamp went out, the light lingered in the room a moment longer, as if the very walls remembered the journey of two souls who had learned that love wasn't just surviving the storm. It was choosing, again and again, to build the calm afterward. The years rolled onward, and the world outside the Dakota plains changed faster than either Clara or Elias could have imagined. Railroads came, telegraphs sang, and cities rose from dust and ambition. But on the ridge above the valley, the Kane ranch endured, unchanged in spirit, steady as the sunrise. By the time Elias's hair had turned white and Clara's hands had grown frail, their love had become legend. Folks in town still told stories of the winter storm that brought a nurse and a rancher together. How fire, snow, and faith had shaped a bond that no hardship could undo. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the ranch hands and neighbors gathered under the same cottonwood trees where the couple had once exchanged vows. Lanterns hung like stars between the branches, and the night shimmered with laughter. Clara wore a simple blue dress, Elias his best vest. They sat side by side on the porch, watching their children and grandchildren dance barefoot in the grass. Elias leaned close and whispered, "You remember the first time you saw me?" Clara laughed, the sound soft as the rustle of wheat. "I remember thinking you were either a savior or a fool to take in a woman half dead in a storm." "And which was it?" "Both," she said, smiling. "But I'm glad you were." They didn't need more words. 40 years of shared mornings and mended fences, of laughter and loss, of storms faced side by side, those had already said everything. As the night deepened, Elias rose to make a toast. His voice was slower now, but still carried the strength of the man who once stared down blizzards and bullets. "To my wife," he began, "who taught me that love isn't something you find, it's something you build. Every sunrise, every choice, every forgiveness. It's a nail and board in a home that can weather anything." The crowd fell silent, the fire crackling softly in the pause that followed. He turned to her then, his eyes bright with tears. "You've been my calm after every storm, Clara. My compass when the wind had no mercy. And if the Lord gives me one more day, I'll spend it thanking him for you." Clara reached for his hand, and the people around them, hardened ranchers, young dreamers, even passing travelers, saw something rare. Not a storybook ending, but the kind of love that lives quietly, stubbornly through the seasons. That night, the wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and memory. When morning came, the valley was wrapped in light. Elias passed away just before dawn, his hand still resting in Clara's. She followed a few months later, peacefully, as if the distance between their hearts was too small to bear apart. They were buried on the hill overlooking the ranch, the same place where Elias once watched for danger and Clara once planted her first wildflowers. Their headstone bore a simple carving, 2 souls, 1 shelter. The wind brought them together, and love kept them home. In the years that followed, the ranch became a school, the clinic a hospital, the land a living memory of kindness. Travelers still stopped to read the inscription and gaze out at the endless sky. The locals said that on quiet evenings, when the wind swept through the valley, it sometimes sounded like laughter. A woman's voice, answering a man's, carried across eternity. The story of Clara and Elias reminds us that love isn't found in comfort or perfection. It's born in the moments when we choose compassion over fear, forgiveness over pride, and hope over the memory of pain. Storms will always come. But the measure of a life isn't how fiercely we fight them. It's how gently we build what stands afterward. Because in the end, what matters most isn't who saved whom in the storm, but that they stayed, hand in hand, long after the wind had passed.